In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And on Krieg, that's not a warning. That's the point. That's all there is. No faces, no names, no wind on your skin. Just a number on a tin tag and a mask you never take off. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story is one you're not supposed to hear, because according to every record in the Departamento Munitorum, it never happened. A Krieg regiment does not fall. A Krieg regiment does not break. That's what the Imperium believes. That's what Krieg believes. This is the story of the 1143rd Siege Regiment and the day that belief was tested. It starts with wind, just wind, coming down from the mountains of a world called Ossivale Tertius, carrying the smell of living soil. And a soldier who has never smelled anything alive pauses, just for a heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, a door opens, just a crack. I won't tell you what walks through it, but I will tell you this. This isn't the fall you're expecting. It's quieter than that, and worse. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. They told us the masks were to keep the poison out. That was true in a way. But the masks also kept something else sealed inside, something none of us had the vocabulary to name. Feeling, identity, the quiet, treasonous whisper that you might be more than a number stamped into a tin tag and hung around your throat like a leash. I wore my mask for 11 years before Ossivale Tertius. 11 years of breathing through filters, seeing the galaxy through scratched lenses, hearing orders through the muffled padding of rubberized cloth. I had no face. I had no voice that was truly mine. I was 612 of the 1143rd Death Korps of Krieg Siege Regiment, and I was content in that designation the way a bullet is content inside its casing. I existed to be fired, and when the firing was done, someone would sweep up the brass and stamp a new number on a new casing, and the gun would never know the difference. I am telling you this because I need you to understand what we were before you can understand what we became. And what we became was something the Imperium of man has no word for, because the Imperium does not acknowledge that it is possible. A Krieg regiment does not fall. A Krieg regiment does not break. A Krieg regiment does not turn. We are the dead who have not yet stopped walking, the penitent sons and daughters of a world that burned itself to prove its loyalty, and our faith is written into our marrow, into the calcium of our bones, into the chemical pathways of brains that were conditioned before we could speak. That is what the rest of the Imperium believes about us. That is what we believed about ourselves. I am here to tell you that it is a lie. Not a deliberate lie, not a constructed falsehood, but something worse. An assumption so deep and so comfortable that nobody ever thought to test it. Because why would you test the loyalty of a weapon that begs to be fired? The 1143rd was a standard siege regiment, assembled from the vitae wombs of Krieg's northern expanse breeding complexes and processed through the Krieg training cadres in the way that all of us were processed. There is a word for it in Low Gothic that does not translate well. The closest equivalent is decanting. We were decanted, poured from one vessel into another, from the growth tanks into the barracks, from the barracks into the trenches, from the trenches into the transports, from the transports into whatever hell the Departamento Munitorum had selected for us. Our commanding officer was Colonel-designate 11. A man I never saw without his mask, whose voice I would not have recognized if I had heard it unfiltered. Our commissar was an outsider, as all commissars attached to Krieg regiments are. His name was Brenak Loer, A thin man from Mordian with pale eyes and a permanent expression of faint discomfort, as though he had swallowed something that disagreed with him and was too polite to mention it. He had been assigned to us because someone in the commissariat believed that watching over a Krieg regiment was a reward posting. No discipline problems, no desertion, no cowardice, just 10,000 soldiers who wanted to die, and a commissar whose only job was to make sure they died in the right direction. I want to be clear about something. I do not hate what I was. I do not look back on my years as 612 with the contempt that you might expect from someone who has tasted what I have tasted. There was a purity in it, a simplicity. You woke when the chrono chime sounded. You ate your ration block. You maintained your weapon. You dug your trench. You advanced when ordered. You died when required. There was no anxiety in it because there were no choices. The weight of existence, the terrible burden of deciding what to do with the hours you have been given, was lifted from your shoulders and placed in the hands of officers and quartermasters and the vast, grinding machinery of the Departmental Munitorum. I did not know I was carrying nothing. You cannot miss what you have never held, and that is precisely why we were vulnerable. Oscival Tertius was classified as a Category 3 civilized world in the Segmentum Tempestus, positioned along a minor trade route that connected two unremarkable subsectors. It had been colonized during the Great Crusade, populated by settlers who had built their cities in the wide green valleys between mountain ranges that ran like vertebrae along the planet's equatorial belt. It produced agricultural goods, light manufactured components, and enough tithe-grade manpower to keep the Munitorum satisfied without being remarkable. By the standards of the 41st millennium, it was boring, safe, the kind of world that existed in the background of the Imperium's vast tapestry, never important enough to be noticed, never troubled enough to require intervention. That should have been the first warning. In my experience, the safest-looking worlds are the ones that have already been hollowed out from the inside. We were deployed to Oscival Tertius in response to a priority astropathic distress signal indicating widespread civil insurrection with suspected heretical elements. The briefing was standard. The planetary governor had lost control of two of the three major population centers. Heretic militias were operating in the mountain passes. There were unconfirmed reports of warp-tainted activity in the agricultural lowlands. Our orders were simple. Establish a siege perimeter around the largest rebel-held city, designated Objective Primus. Reduce it, pacify the planet, move on to the next deployment. For a Krieg siege regiment, this was routine work. We had done it before on Vandrek's Fall, on the Phosphor Line at Gethren, on a dozen other worlds whose names I have forgotten because they were not worth remembering. We expected trenches. We expected attrition. We expected casualties. We expected to die. What we did not expect was the wind. I remember the wind. That is the detail that has stayed with me through everything that followed. Through the corruption and the ecstasy and the horror and the purging. The wind on Oscival Tertius. It came down from the mountains in the late afternoon, carrying with it the scent of vegetation, of growing things, of soil that was rich and dark and wet. I had never smelled anything like it. Krieg is a corpse of a world. Its atmosphere is a recycled soup of chemical residue and radiation-scrubbed particulate, and even that is only tolerable through a rebreather. The training camps smell of disinfectant and gun oil and the faint metallic tang of the vitae womb, nutrient solution that clings to your skin for the first years of your life. Every world I had been deployed to before Oscival had been a war zone. And war zones smell of cordite and blood and the particular sweetness of decomposing flesh that becomes so familiar you stop noticing it. But the wind on Oscival Tertius smelled alive. It smelled like something I had no name for, because on Krieg, there is no word for it. The closest I can come is this. It smelled like the opposite of everything I had ever known. We established our forward positions in the foothills east of Objective Primus, following standard Krieg siege doctrine. The engineers began cutting the first parallel trench within 6 hours of deployment. The artillery companies set up their positions on the ridgeline. The supply corps established the logistics chain. Everything was by the manual. Everything was as it should have been. And yet, even in those first hours, something was different. I noticed it in the way the soldiers moved. There was a hesitation that had not been there before. Not reluctance, not fear, but something more subtle. A pause. A moment between the order and the action where a man might turn his head slightly, as though listening to something just below the threshold of hearing. I noticed it because I did it myself. I would be carrying an ammunition crate to a forward position, and I would stop just for a heartbeat, and I would feel the wind on the exposed skin of my wrists between my gloves and my sleeves, and something inside my chest would shift, like a gear that had been locked in place, suddenly finding a new position. I did not report it. What would I have said? Watchmaster, I felt something. That is not a sentence that exists in the vocabulary of a Krieg soldier. We do not feel things. We execute orders. We fulfill our purpose. We atone. If I had gone to Quartermaster 91 and told him that the wind made me pause, he would have recorded it as a potential morale deviation, flagged me for reassignment to a forward assault squad, where I would die in the next wave, and replaced me with the next number in the roster. And I would have accepted that because that is what we do. But I did not report it, and in that silence, in that first small act of choosing not to speak, the door opened. Just a crack. Just enough for something to slip through. The siege of Objective Primus began on the 14th day after deployment. The rebel positions were well fortified, built into the ruins of the city's eastern industrial district, with overlapping fields of fire and deep bunker networks that our preliminary bombardment barely scratched. Our first assault wave went in at dawn, 600 men advancing across open ground toward the outer defensive perimeter. Standard Krieg doctrine. The first wave dies to identify the enemy positions. The second wave dies to exhaust their ammunition. The third wave takes the objective. It is a mathematics of flesh, a calculus of acceptable loss, and we had been taught to accept it the way you accept gravity. It is simply the way things are. 412 soldiers of the first wave died in the first 90 seconds. I know this because the quartermaster's servitors counted the bodies afterward, cataloging each tin tag, each las weapon, each pair of boots for redistribution. I watched them work from the second parallel trench, waiting for my own wave to be called forward, and I felt nothing. That is not a figure of speech. I felt precisely nothing. Not grief, not anger, not fear. Not even the grim satisfaction that some Krieg soldiers report when they see their comrades achieve the death they were bred for. Just nothing. An empty space where a reaction should have been, like a room with the furniture removed. I had seen men die before. I had seen them blown apart by artillery, cut down by las fire, crushed beneath the treads of armored vehicles. Each time I had felt that same nothing. It was my default state, my resting frequency, and it should have stayed that way. But as I crouched in that trench, watching the servitors drag the dead through the mud, the wind came down from the mountains again, and it carried something on it that was not a scent. It was a vibration, a resonance, something that bypassed my rebreather filters entirely and settled into the bones of my skull like a tuning fork pressed against the temple. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I looked at the dead and I thought, that could have been me. Not as an observation, not as a tactical assessment, as a feeling. A cold, bright, terrifying feeling that expanded in my chest like a detonation in slow motion, and I understood with a clarity that was almost painful that I did not want to die. That was the moment it began. Not with corruption, not with temptation, not with any of the mechanisms that the Ordo Hereticus would later attribute to our fall. It began with the simplest, most human revelation imaginable. The discovery that I was alive and that being alive meant something to me. For a normal human, this is not a revelation. It is a starting condition. But for a soldier of Krieg, for a product of the Vitae Wombs and the indoctrination cadres and 500 years of penitential culture, it was heresy of the most fundamental kind. It was the first step on a road that led to places I could not have imagined, and it began not with a demon's whisper or a sorcerer's spell, but with the wind on Ossivael Tertius, and the smell of living things. I should tell you about the city. Objective Primus had been called Essendra before the insurrection, and it was, by all accounts, an unremarkable place. 3 million inhabitants, a manufacturing sector that produced agricultural processing equipment, a modest cathedral to the God Emperor, a governor's palace that had been built in the administratum utilitarian style, which is a polite way of saying it was an ugly block of gray rockcrete with an aquila bolted to the front. The city sat in a valley where 2 rivers met, surrounded by farmland that stretched to the base of the mountains in every direction. From the ridgeline where our artillery was positioned, you could see the whole thing laid out beneath you like a diagram in a tactical manual. Neat, orderly, except that it was burning and the smoke that rose from the fires was the wrong color. I did not notice this at first. Smoke is smoke. It rises, it obscures, it gets in your eyes and your rebreather filters. But the smoke from Essendra was not gray or black or the oily brown of burning petrochemicals. It was faintly iridescent. In certain light, at certain angles, it caught the sun and threw off colors that I had never seen before. Not because the colors were alien or impossible, but because I had never looked at smoke closely enough to see color in it. That is the thing about Krieg conditioning. It does not blind you. It simply teaches you that looking is unnecessary. You see what you need to see to perform your function. Threat indicators, terrain features, fire lanes. The color of smoke is irrelevant data, and irrelevant data is filtered out before it reaches conscious processing. But on Ossivael Tertius, the filters were failing. Slowly, imperceptibly, like a lens fogging from the inside, the conditioning that had shaped my perception of reality for 11 years was beginning to degrade. The siege continued according to doctrine. Second assault, third assault. The outer perimeter fell on the 22nd day after we breached the main gate with concentrated heavy mortar fire, and the grenadiers went in with fixed bayonets. I was part of the 4th wave, the consolidation force, and I entered the city for the first time through a gap in the wall that the engineers had blown with melter charges. Inside, Essendra was a labyrinth of narrow streets and collapsed buildings, and the fighting was close and brutal in the way that urban warfare always is. Room to room, floor to floor, each doorway a potential ambush, each window a sniper's nest. This was the kind of fighting that Krieg soldiers excel at, not because we are tactically superior, but because we do not care. An open doorway is a threat, and the standard response is to throw a fragmentation grenade through it and walk in over whatever remains. I remember one building in particular, a hab block on the corner of a commercial intersection, 4 stories tall, the upper floors blown open by mortar fire, but the ground level intact. We stacked on the door in standard breach formation, 4 soldiers, myself leading. The grenadier behind me put a melter charge on the lock. The door blew inward, and I was through it before the debris had settled, last weapon up, the world narrowing to the green-tinged tunnel of my rebreather lenses. The hallway was dark and choked with dust, and I could hear movement on the floor above, the scrape of furniture being dragged across tile, the metallic clatter of a weapon being loaded. I signaled the squad forward. We moved in pairs, covering each angle, our boots crunching on broken glass and plaster. At the end of the hallway was a staircase, and at the top of the staircase was a barricade made of overturned tables and mattress padding, and behind the barricade were 3 figures, 2 women and a man, and they opened fire the moment my helmet crested the top step. The last bolts hit the wall beside my head, and I felt the heat of them on the exposed skin of my neck, a bright, searing line that drew a gasp from me, not of pain but of surprise, because on some level I had forgotten that last fire was hot, that it carried physical sensation, that being shot at was an experience and not merely a tactical condition. I returned fire on instinct, 2 shots, and the man behind the barricade dropped backward with a hole through his chest the size of my fist. The women kept firing. The grenadier beside me took a bolt to the shoulder and spun into the wall and went down without a sound, because Krieg soldiers do not make sounds when they are hit, and I stepped over him and fired again, twice, and the stairwell was quiet. We cleared the building in 11 minutes. 14 rebel defenders, all dead. 2 of ours dead, 1 wounded. The wounded man's last wound was cauterized by the heat of the bolt that made it, which meant no bleeding, which meant the quartermaster would not need to waste a field dressing. Efficient, clean. I felt nothing about any of it. I noted the casualties, checked my weapons charge pack, and moved to the next building. 41 soldiers died that first day in the city. I did not die. I noted this without commentary and continued to advance. But the city was strange. The rebels we killed were not what I had expected. They were civilians, yes, armed with a mix of auto rifles and improvised weapons, but they did not fight like heretics. I had fought heretics before on the Phosphor line at Gethrin, where a chaos cult had raised an army of mutants and warp-touched fanatics who charged our positions screaming the names of dark gods, their flesh already twisting with the marks of corruption. Those heretics had been obvious, visible. Their taint was written on their bodies in scales and horns and too many eyes. The rebels of Essendra were none of those things. They were thin, exhausted, desperate people who fired at us from behind barricades made of furniture and paving stones. And when we killed them, they died like anyone else. They bled red. They screamed in low Gothic. They begged for mercy with the same words any Imperial citizen would use, invoking the Emperor's name with what sounded, to my newly uncertain ears, like genuine faith. I mentioned this to no one. But I was not the only one who noticed. On the 28th day of the siege, I was rotating out of a forward position when I passed a squad from 3rd Platoon, resting in the ruins of what had once been a bakery. The ovens were cold and the walls were scorched, but the space still held a ghost of warmth, a residual comfort that seemed to emanate from the brickwork itself. I glanced at them as I passed, and something stopped me. One of them had removed his mask. He was sitting against the wall with his rebreather hanging loose around his neck, his face exposed to the open air, and he was breathing. Just breathing. Not gasping, not hyperventilating, not in respiratory distress. Breathing slowly and deliberately through his nose, his eyes half closed, his expression one of profound and terrible concentration, as though he were performing a task of enormous complexity and delicacy. I had never seen a Krieg soldier's face before. We do not remove our masks in the field. We do not remove them in the barracks. Some of us do not remove them at all. from the day they are issued to the day they are cut away by the quartermaster's servitors and placed on the next body. To see a man's face was to see something private and vulnerable and utterly alien. He was young. They are all young on Krieg. His skin was pale and smooth, and his features were unremarkable, the generic symmetry of Vitae womb genetics. But his expression was not generic. His expression was singular. His expression was his. He saw me looking, and he did not flinch. He did not scramble to replace his mask. He held my gaze through my lenses with his naked eyes, and he said in a voice that was raw and unfiltered and startlingly clear, "The air here tastes like something, Watchmaster. I wanted to know what." I should have reported him. Removal of protective equipment in a combat zone is a disciplinary infraction, and for a Krieg soldier, any infraction is grounds for reassignment to a penal detachment or immediate execution at the commissar's discretion. The correct response was to draw my las pistol and shoot him where he sat, because that is what a watchmaster does when a soldier deviates from protocol. Instead, I nodded once and walked on. And as I walked, I reached up and loosened the seal on my own mask, just slightly, just enough to let a thin thread of unfiltered air slip through, and I breathed it in, and I understood what he meant. The air tasted like something. It tasted like warmth and dust and green growing things, and the faintest sweetness, like fruit left in the sun, and beneath all of that, so deep and so subtle that it was less a flavor than a feeling, something that hummed against the palate and the sinuses and the soft tissue at the back of the throat, something that said in a language older than words, "You are here. You are alive." Is that not wonderful? I sealed my mask again. I continued to my assigned position. I said nothing to anyone. But the taste stayed with me, settling into a corner of my mind that I had not known existed, and it would not leave. I have thought about that moment many times since then, turning it over like a strange stone found in the bottom of a trench, and I have come to believe that it was not the air itself that was tainted. The air was just air. What was tainted was us. Something in the environment of Ossivael Tertius was resonating at a frequency that the human nervous system was designed to receive, a frequency that had been deliberately suppressed in us by decades of conditioning, and the planet's vibration was unlocking it, reactivating neural pathways that had been chemically sealed, reopening doors that the indoctrination cadres had welded shut. The planet was not corrupting us. It was waking us up, and that, in the end, amounted to the same thing. The changes accelerated. By the 5th week of the siege, there were reports filtering back through the company structure that were unlike anything in the standard deviation parameters. Soldiers removing their masks for extended periods. Soldiers pausing mid-task to examine objects of no tactical relevance. A piece of broken glass, a child's toy found in the rubble, a flower growing in the crack of a ruined wall. Soldiers speaking to each other in voices that were not the clipped, functional exchanges of military communication, but something looser, something that wandered and explored, and occasionally, impossibly, laughed. The quartermasters flagged these as morale anomalies and began compiling incident reports with the methodical precision that is their particular gift, but they did not escalate them to regimental command. Not because they were negligent, but because the anomalies were difficult to classify. What regulation covers a soldier who stops to look at a flower? What disciplinary code addresses the crime of laughter? These were behaviors that fell outside the framework of Krieg military law because nobody had ever imagined they would need to be legislated against. Commissar Loer noticed. Of course he did. It was his function to notice, the way it was our function to dig trenches and die. He began appearing at odd hours in the forward positions, watching, listening, his pale eyes moving from soldier to soldier with an expression that had shifted from his habitual discomfort to something more alert, more predatory. He conducted random inspections, he checked rebreather seals, he reviewed the quartermaster's reports, and he found nothing actionable because the soldiers were still fighting, still advancing, still dying in the prescribed numbers and the prescribed manner. The siege was proceeding ahead of schedule, in fact. Our casualty rates were within acceptable parameters. Objective Primus was being systematically reduced, block by block, as per doctrine. On paper, the 1143rd was performing exactly as expected. It was only when you looked closely, when you listened to the texture of the silence between orders, when you watched the way a soldier held his weapon or turned his head toward the mountains when the wind came down, that you could see something fundamental had shifted. We were still soldiers. We were still Krieg. But we were becoming something else as well, something that had no designation and no number, and the becoming was accelerating. I need to tell you about the Commissar now, because what happened to Branagh Loer is essential to understanding what happened to the rest of us. The Imperium's narrative, if it bothered to construct one, which it did not because this story was never told, would cast the Commissar as the last line of defense, the faithful watchdog who fought the corruption to his final breath. The reality was considerably more complicated and, I think, considerably more honest. Lore was not a bad man. He was not corrupt. He was not weak. He was a product of the Schola Progenium and the Commissariat, which means he had been trained from childhood to detect deviation, to identify heresy, to serve as the Emperor's moral instrument in the ranks of his armies. He was very good at his job, and that is precisely why he fell first, because Loer was the only man in the regiment who had ever been taught to pay attention to feelings. We had been taught to suppress them. He had been taught to observe them, to read them in other men's faces and voices and postures, to sense the shift in morale before it became a rout. His entire professional training was built on emotional awareness, on the ability to gauge the interior state of the soldiers around him and respond accordingly. And when the resonance of Ossaviel Tertius began to work on the regiment, Leur's finely tuned sensitivity was not a defense. It was a vulnerability. He felt it before any of us did. He felt it more deeply than any of us could. And because he was the only man in the regiment who understood what feelings were, he was the only man who could be seduced by the promise of more of them. I did not witness Leur's turning. Nobody did, because it did not happen in a single moment. It happened the way rust happens, the way erosion happens, in increments so small that they are invisible until the structure they have been working on collapses. But I can reconstruct it from what I observed and from what he told me later, in the days after he stopped pretending, when he walked among us with his cap removed and his pale hair catching the afternoon light, and his eyes shining with something that was not quite madness and not quite revelation, but occupied the territory between the two. It began, he said, with sound. Not the sounds of the siege, which were the sounds of every siege, the percussion of artillery and the sharp crack of lass fire and the wet, intimate noises of men being killed, but the sounds beneath those sounds, the resonance of the city itself, the way the ruins hummed when the wind moved through them, the way the rubble sang in frequencies that were just below the range of conscious hearing. Loer began to hear music in the bombardment, not metaphorical music, not the grim poetry of war that men sometimes construct to make their suffering bearable, but actual melody, actual harmony, as though the destruction were being composed by an intelligence that understood the mathematical relationships between tones. He said it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. He said it made the hymns of the ecclesiarchy sound like the banging of pots. And he said that once he heard it, he could not unhear it, and every moment of silence became an absence, a hunger, a need that grew louder with each passing day. This is how Slaanesh works, not through spectacle, not through the lurid excess that the Ordo Hereticus describes in its training manuals, the orgies and the mutations and the screaming demonic revelry. Those come later, if they come at all. The initial corruption is almost unbearably gentle. It is the offer of something you did not know you wanted until it was placed in front of you. For Lore, it was beauty. For others, it was different things. For a corpsman, it was the sensation of warm water on his skin when he found a functioning bath in an abandoned hab unit and submerged himself in it for the first time in his life. For a grenadier, it was the taste of fresh bread found in a bakery that had somehow survived the bombardment, still warm from an oven that nobody had tended. For an engineer, it was the discovery that the patterns he scratched in the mud of the trench walls were not random but deliberate, that his hands were creating something, shapes and lines that pleased the eye in ways he could not explain and did not want to stop. For me, it was names. I found a library on the 39th day. It was buried in the basement of a skolam that had taken a direct hit from one of our Earthshaker rounds, and the upper floors had collapsed into the lower ones, creating a compressed ruin of plescrete and broken furniture. And beneath all of it, books. Real books, printed on paper, bound in leather, the kind of archaic luxury that most Imperial citizens never see. I was clearing the building as part of a standard sweep when my boot broke through a weakened floor section, and I fell into the basement, landing on a pile of rubble that shifted beneath me and revealed, like a vein of precious ore exposed by a pickaxe, a shelf of intact volumes. I should have reported the structural hazard, climbed out, and continued the sweep. Instead, I picked up a book. It was a history of Ossivale Tertius, written in High Gothic with illuminated capitals and hand-drawn maps, and it was the first book I had ever held. On Krieg, there are no books. There are training manuals, equipment specifications, hymnals of the Imperial cult, and the uplifting primer. And these are not books in the way that this object was a book. They are functional documents. This thing in my hands was something else. It had weight and texture and a smell that I can only describe as accumulated time, the compressed essence of centuries spent existing, of being opened and closed and read and shelved and forgotten and found again. I opened it to a random page and I read the first word my eyes fell on, and the word was a name, Veradin. It was the name of a river that had once run through the valley where Essendra now stood, a river that had been diverted and channeled underground centuries ago to make room for the city's expansion, a dead river, a forgotten name. And when I read it, something happened inside my chest that was like the feeling I had experienced in the trench, watching the dead but stronger and more specific. It was the feeling of recognition, of finding something that fit, as though a slot in my interior architecture that I had never known was empty had suddenly been filled. I tore the page from the book. I folded it and placed it inside my uniform, against my skin, and I carried it with me for the rest of the campaign. And from that day forward, in the privacy of my own thoughts, in the space behind my mask where no one could see and no one could hear, I was no longer 612. I was Veradin. I had a name. I had committed the most fundamental heresy available to a soldier of Krieg. I had become an individual. Now, I need to tell you what was actually happening on Ossivale Tertius, because the truth of it was not what any of us believed. Not the regiment, not the commissar, not even the Departamento Munitorum officers who had processed our deployment orders. The insurrection was real. The rebels were real. The fighting was real, and the dying was real, and the blood in the streets was as genuine as any blood I have ever seen. But the cause of it, the origin of the crisis that had drawn us to this world, was not what the intelligence briefings described. There was no heretic conspiracy. There was no organized cult of rebellion against the Imperium. The people of Essendra had risen up because they had gone mad, and they had gone mad because the planet itself had been singing to them for decades, and the song had finally become too loud to ignore. I did not discover this through investigation or intelligence work. I discovered it because of the Quartermaster. Quartermaster 91 was, in many ways, the most Krieg of all of us. The Quartermasters always are. They are chosen for their mental resilience, their faith, their ability to perform the gruesome calculus of battlefield resource management without emotional interference. They tag the dead. They strip the bodies. They redistribute equipment. They are the accountants of attrition, and they do their work with the cold precision of servitors, because if they did not, the sheer weight of what they handle every day would break them. 91 was exemplary in his role. He maintained his records with meticulous accuracy. He performed last rites with the mechanical devotion of a man who has said the same words 10,000 times and will say them 10,000 more. He was the last man in the regiment I would have expected to notice something wrong. And yet he did, because his records told him so. He came to me on the 43rd day, which was unusual in itself. Quartermasters do not seek out watchmasters for conversation. But he found me at my post, and he stood there for a moment, his mask impassive, his data slate held against his chest like a shield. And he said, "Watchmaster, the dead are wrong." I asked him to clarify. He showed me his records. The enemy dead, the rebels we had been killing since the first assault, the supposed heretics whose bodies we had been stepping over and pushing into mass graves and occasionally burning when ordered. He had been performing his standard post-engagement autopsies, checking for signs of warp taint, cataloging mutations, recording the physical markers of chaos corruption that the Quartermaster's manual required him to look for. And he had found nothing. Not one mutation. Not one stigmata. Not one sign of any of the physical markers that the Ordo Hereticus lists as indicators of demonic influence or chaos worship. The rebels were clean, genetically standard, physiologically normal. They had no marks of chaos, no ritual scarification, no forbidden texts or icons. They were, by every measurable criterion, loyal Imperial citizens. They were not heretics, the Quartermaster said, and his voice had a quality I had never heard in a Krieg soldier before. It was troubled. Not confused, not uncertain, but actively distressed, as though the data on his slate were causing him physical discomfort. They were not corrupted. They were something else. He did not know what. Neither did I, but the implication was clear, and it settled over us like a weight. We had been killing innocent people. Not traitors, not heretics, not enemies of the Emperor, but terrified civilians who had been driven to violence by something they did not understand, something that was being done to them by the world they lived on, and we had been sent to punish them for it. This information should have been devastating. For a loyal servant of the Emperor, the knowledge that you have been killing his faithful subjects should be a wound that bleeds forever. But here is the dark truth that I must confess, and I confess it not with shame, but with the strange, clear-eyed honesty that the corruption granted me. It was not the killing of innocents that disturbed me. We are Krieg. We are weapons. Weapons do not choose their targets. What disturbed me was that I felt disturbed at all. That the information mattered to me, that the dead had become more than numbers on a Quartermaster's slate, that they had become people, and that their deaths had weight and meaning and moral consequence that I could feel pressing against the inside of my chest like a hand placed flat against the sternum. The corruption was not making us evil, it was making us human. And for soldiers of Krieg, there is no difference. The colonel called a command briefing on the 45th day. This was not unusual in itself, but the nature of the briefing was without precedent in my experience. Colonel-designate 11 stood before his officers in the command bunker, a prefabricated structure half buried in the hillside behind our third parallel trench, and he did something that I had never seen a Krieg commanding officer do. He asked a question, not a tactical question, not a request for status updates or casualty figures or ammunition expenditure reports. He looked at us through his mask, his voice filtered through the rebreather's vocoder into the flat, toneless register that all Krieg voices share. And he said, "Something is wrong with this campaign. I want to know what." The silence that followed was extraordinary. 10 officers standing in a bunker, the muffled percussion of the artillery barrage outside providing a steady rhythm, and not one of them spoke. Not because they did not know the answer, but because the answer required them to acknowledge something that Krieg officers are not equipped to acknowledge, that they had noticed, that they had felt, that the campaign had touched them in ways that fell outside the parameters of standard operational experience. It was Lore who broke the silence, and when he spoke, his voice was different. The permanent discomfort was gone. In its place was something fluid and confident, a voice that seemed to enjoy the shape of its own words, and I remember thinking with a clarity that surprised me that it was a beautiful voice. "The planet is corrupted," he said. "Not the people, the planet, the soil, the air, the water, the light. Everything. The insurrection is a symptom, not a cause. These people were exposed to whatever this is for decades, and it drove them to a state of heightened sensation that eventually became violent. We are experiencing an accelerated version of the same process." The colonel looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "And what do you recommend, Commissar?" Loer smiled. I could not see the smile through his mask, but I could hear it in his voice, and hearing a smile was itself a new experience, another small door opening in the architecture of my perception. "I recommend," he said, "that we find the source." This was the moment where doctrine and reality diverged beyond reconciliation. Standard protocol for suspected large-scale chaos contamination is immediate withdrawal and quarantine, followed by an inquisitorial investigation and, if warranted, exterminatus. The colonel should have ordered a full retreat. He should have sealed the regiment in its transports and requested astropathic contact with the nearest Ordo Hereticus conclave. He should have done many things. Instead, he nodded and authorized a reconnaissance mission into the heart of Essendra. He sent Loer to lead it, with a platoon of grenadiers and the quartermaster's forensic detail. He sent me with them. I do not know why he chose me specifically. Perhaps he sensed that I was already further along the path than most. Perhaps he simply needed a watchmaster to maintain unit discipline. Perhaps it did not matter, and any choice would have led to the same outcome. We moved into the city's core at dawn on the 46th day. The outer districts had been reduced to rubble by the siege, but as we pushed deeper, the destruction became less uniform. Whole blocks stood untouched. Streets were intact, their cobblestones still fitted neatly together, their lampposts still standing, though the lumens had long since gone dark. It was as though the city had two layers, one destroyed and one preserved, and we were moving from the former into the latter. The deeper we went, the more intact the buildings became, and the more apparent it became that Essendra had not been an unremarkable city at all. The architecture in the inner districts was old, much older than the colony's official founding date would suggest. The buildings were constructed from a pale stone that I did not recognize, and their design was unlike anything in the Administratum's standardized construction catalogs. The proportions were wrong. Not wrong in the way that chaos architecture is wrong, with its impossible angles and non-Euclidean geometries, but wrong in a way that was subtly, almost imperceptibly beautiful. The doorways were slightly taller than they needed to be. The windows were slightly wider. The streets curved in gentle arcs rather than meeting at right angles. Everything was designed to be pleasing to move through, and moving through it produced a sensation of ease and flow that was deeply, deeply unsettling for soldiers who had spent their lives in trenches and bunkers, built for function rather than comfort. Loer led us to the city's central square, where the cathedral of the god emperor stood facing the governor's palace across an open plaza paved with the same pale stone. The cathedral was intact. Not damaged, not abandoned, but intact and clean and apparently maintained, its doors standing open, its interior lit by candles that were still burning. We entered with weapons raised, expecting an ambush. What we found was worse than any ambush. The cathedral was empty, completely empty. The pews, the altar, the aquila, the devotional statues, the votive candles in their iron racks. Everything was in its place, undisturbed, as though the congregation had simply stood up and walked out and never come back. But the candles were burning. Fresh candles recently placed, their wax barely melted. Someone was tending this place. Someone was maintaining it, and carved into the stone floor of the nave, so large that you could only see the full design from the gallery above, was a symbol. It was not an Imperial symbol. It was not a chaos mark, not any of the 8-pointed stars or demon sigils that the Ordo Hereticus had catalogued and distributed in their field identification guides. It was a spiral. A 6-armed spiral that turned inward on itself in a pattern that seemed to move even though it was carved in stone, and looking at it produced a sensation in the pit of the stomach that was halfway between nausea and arousal, a tightening that was not entirely unpleasant. The quartermaster identified it. He had been trained to recognize the pre-Imperial Xenos archaeological markers that the Ordo Xenos had flagged as potentially significant, and this symbol was in his database. It was Aeldari. Not modern Aeldari, not the austere craft-world designs or the Baroque dark Eldar aesthetics, but something older, something from before the fall, from the period of Aeldari history that the Eldar themselves refused to discuss, the era of unrestrained hedonism and psychic excess that had ultimately birthed a god. The symbol was a resonance marker, the quartermaster explained, reading from his data slate in a voice that grew steadily less steady as he spoke. It was a navigational aid, a signpost in a network of psychic amplification nodes that the pre-fall Aeldari had constructed across their empire. The nodes were designed to collect and intensify emotional energy, to gather the psychic resonance of living beings and focus it into the warp. The ancient Eldari had built them as pleasure engines, as instruments of sensation, as devices for the generation and concentration of the raw emotional material that would eventually coalesce into the youngest and most terrible of the Chaos Gods. There was one beneath Essendra, buried deep, older than the human colony by millions of years, a pre-fall Aeldari resonance engine that had been sleeping in the bedrock of Osavael Tertius since before humanity had learned to make fire, and something had woken it up. Perhaps it was the colony itself, the accumulation of 3 million human minds living and feeling and wanting above it for centuries. Perhaps it was a geological event, a shift in the planet's crust that had broken through some ancient seal. Perhaps it was simply time, the patient grinding of entropy that wears down all barriers eventually. The cause did not matter. What mattered was the effect. The engine was active. It had been active for decades, and it had been doing exactly what it was designed to do, gathering emotional energy, amplifying it, feeding it into the warp, feeding it to Slaanesh. The entire population of Essendra had been living above a machine that was systematically intensifying their capacity for sensation, stripping away their inhibitions, opening their minds to experiences that the human nervous system was never meant to process at that volume. The insurrection was not rebellion. It was overstimulation. 3 million people driven past the threshold of what their neurology could contain, erupting into violence not out of ideology, but out of the sheer, unbearable intensity of being alive. And now it was doing the same thing to us. To 10,000 soldiers of Krieg who had been engineered from birth to feel nothing, and who were now, for the first time in their lives, beginning to feel everything. Lower stood at the edge of the spiral carved into the cathedral floor, and he looked down into it, and when he looked up, his mask was in his hands. He had taken it off. His face was sharp and angular, with cheekbones that caught the candlelight and eyes that seemed to hold more light than the room provided, and he was smiling, and the smile was the most frightening thing I had ever seen. Not because it was malicious, not because it was corrupt, but because it was genuine. It was the smile of a man who has been handed the answer to a question he has been asking his entire life, and the answer is worse than he feared and better than he hoped. "It is not a weapon," he said, and his voice filled the cathedral with an ease that seemed natural, as though the building had been designed for the human voice and had been waiting all these centuries to hear one. "It is an instrument, and we are the music." I should have shot him then. That is what a loyal soldier of the Imperium would have done. That is what a loyal soldier of Krieg would have done. I had my las pistol on my hip and my training in my bones and the Emperor's light in my heart, or at least in the place where his light was supposed to be. And I could have ended it there. One shot. One commissar dead on the floor of a cathedral. One anomaly resolved, one incident report filed, one more body for the quartermaster to process. But I did not shoot him, and the grenadiers around me did not shoot him. And the quartermaster, standing with his data slate still in his hands, his servitors motionless behind him like faithful dogs, did not call for his execution, because we had all felt it. The engine beneath our feet was singing, and we could hear it now. All of us, not as a sound, but as a presence. A warmth. A fullness in the chest that was the exact opposite of the emptiness we had carried for our entire lives. And the thing about emptiness is that once you become aware of it, once you feel the shape of the void inside you, you will do anything, anything at all, to fill it. We returned to the regiment's lines as the sun was setting, and the light that came through the mountain passes was the color of bruised fruit, purple and gold and deep, aching red. And I looked at it, and I thought, I have been alive for 11 years, and I have never once looked at a sunset, and the grief of that lost time hit me like a round to the chest, and I staggered, physically staggered, under the weight of something that was not pain and was not pleasure, but was simply feeling, raw and unfiltered and enormous. And I understood then that there was no going back. Not for me, not for any of us. The door that had been opened could not be closed, because closing it meant returning to the numbness. And the numbness, which had once been our armor and our identity and our entire reason for being, now felt like death. Not the clean, purposeful death of a Krieg soldier fulfilling his duty, but a small, mean, suffocating death, the death of a thing that never lived. The transformation of the 1143rd Death Korps of Krieg Siege Regiment took place over the following weeks, and it was, in its terrible way, the most magnificent thing I have ever witnessed. I use that word deliberately, magnificent, because the Imperium's vocabulary, with its grim pragmatism and its theological severity, does not have adequate language for what we became, and the only word that comes close is one that carries within it both grandeur and horror in equal measure. It began with the masks. One by one, platoon by platoon, company by company, the soldiers of the 1143rd removed their rebreathers and looked at the world with naked eyes for the first time since they had been issued their equipment on Krieg. There is an irony in this that I only understood later. The devotees of the Dark Prince, the Chaos God, whose fingerprints were all over what was happening to us, are famous for wearing masks. Ritual masks, porcelain and gold, to conceal their identities and free themselves from the constraints of selfhood. We were doing the opposite. We were tearing masks off to find our identities. But the mechanism was the same. The mask is the boundary between what you are and what you could become. And whether you put it on or take it off, the act of crossing that boundary is the moment the door opens. Some did it quickly, tearing the masks away with a violence that suggested they were removing something that had been suffocating them. Others did it slowly, reverently, peeling back the rubberized cloth with the careful deliberation of a man unwrapping something precious. A few refused. There were holdouts, soldiers whose conditioning held firm against the resonance, whose faith in the Emperor's purpose burned bright enough to resist the pull of sensation. These soldiers were not punished or coerced. They were simply left alone, and over time, most of them removed their masks of their own volition, because the isolation of being the only masked face in a regiment of exposed ones became its own kind of unbearable. To be the one who refuses to feel, surrounded by those who have discovered feeling, is a loneliness that no amount of faith can armor you against. It was 6 companies that broke first, all on the same day, as though whatever force was working on us operated in multiples of that number. I did not think anything of it at the time. 6 is just a number. But looking back, the pattern was everywhere, woven through the structure of our corruption like a signature. 6 hours the colonel spent in silence before he broke. 6 heartbeats between breaths when the resonance was at its strongest. The 6 arms of the spiral carved into the cathedral floor. The number recurred with a frequency that defied coincidence, as though whatever was reshaping us had an aesthetic preference for that particular integer. And I did not learn until much later that 6 is the sacred number of the god we were feeding. The faces that emerged were, almost without exception, young, pale, smooth, the generic product of vitae womb genetics, designed for function rather than individuality. But faces, even generic faces, are unique. The distribution of light across a cheekbone, the way the mouth moves when it speaks, the particular depth and color of eyes that have never been seen by anyone before. These differences, which would be unremarkable on any other world, were revelations to us. We had never seen each other. We had spent years fighting side by side, sharing trenches, sharing rations, sharing the intimate proximity of soldiers in the field. And we had never once looked at the person next to us and known them as anything other than a number and a function. Now, suddenly, there were faces. There were people. And the shock of recognition, the simple, overwhelming experience of seeing another human being and being seen in return, produced a cascade of emotional responses that the resonance engine beneath the city amplified and fed back to us in a loop that grew stronger with each iteration. It was Thiel who first noticed the changes in the flesh. He came to me one evening in the forward trenches, his mask hanging around his neck as had become his habit, and he held out his hands, palms up, and said, "Varadhin, look." His skin had changed, not dramatically, not in the grotesque way that chaos mutations are described in the training primers, but subtly, in a way that was almost impossible to categorize as wrong. His hands were smoother than they should have been. The calluses from years of handling lass weapons and entrenching tools had not simply softened but vanished, as though his body were rewriting itself toward an ideal of unmarked perfection. The skin had a faint luminosity to it, a quality of light that seemed to come from just beneath the surface, the way light comes through fine porcelain when you hold it up to a flame. I looked at my own hands and saw the same thing. The nicks and scars from a decade of service had faded to pale traces, and my fingernails, which I had always kept bitten to the quick in the standard Krieg fashion, had grown longer than I had ever allowed them, tapering to points that looked less functional and more ornamental. I had not noticed because the change had been gradual, a millimeter at a time, and because I had never paid attention to my hands before. Hands were tools. You did not look at your tools. Soldiers began to talk. Not the functional exchanges of military communication, the clipped, coded language of fire orders and status reports, but actual conversation. They talked about what they saw. They talked about what they felt. They talked about the wind and the light and the taste of the air and the strange, savage beauty of the ruined city spread out beneath them. Some of them talked about Krieg, about the training complexes and the vitae wombs and the endless gray misery of a world that existed solely to produce soldiers for a war that would never end. They talked about it with a wonder that was close to horror, as though they were describing a nightmare they had only just woken from, and in the spaces between their words, in the pauses and the silences, you could hear the resonance, not as a sound but as a texture, a quality of the air itself that made every moment feel weighted with significance. Names emerged, not all at once, and not for everyone, but slowly, like flowers forcing their way through the cracks in a bombed-out road. Some soldiers chose names from the books and records they found in the city's ruins. Others invented their own, stringing syllables together until they found a combination that felt right, that resonated in the chest the way the engine's frequency resonated in the bones. A few kept their numbers, wearing them like old scars, but even these men began to inflect their designations differently, emphasizing certain digits, softening others, until the numbers themselves became a kind of name, unique and personal. I was Varadin. The soldier who had first removed his mask in the bakery called himself Thale. Loer kept his given name but dropped his rank, insisting that we call him simply Brennock, as though the title of commissar were a garment he had outgrown. And with the names came something else, something less noble, something that I did not want to examine too closely, because examining it meant admitting that the awakening was not entirely a liberation. Possessiveness, jealousy. The discovery of individuality brought with it the discovery of comparison, and comparison is the soil from which envy grows. I found myself resenting the soldiers whose awakenings had been more dramatic than mine. Thale, who had been the first to remove his mask, and who wore his boldness like a crown. The engineer who had called himself Dravith, whose patterns in the mud had evolved into intricate wall carvings that drew admiration from every soldier who passed them. A grenadier whose name was Cathara, who had discovered that she could sing, and whose voice, unfiltered by any mask, was so piercingly clear that men stopped in the middle of firefights to listen. I was jealous of her. I was jealous of the intensity of her experience, of the depth of her talent, of the way the resonance seemed to flow through her more purely and more powerfully than through the rest of us. I wanted what she had. I wanted my experience to be the most vivid, my awakening to be the most complete, my name to carry the most weight. And I caught myself thinking these thoughts, and I was ashamed. And then I noticed that the shame itself was intense and interesting and almost pleasurable, and I was ashamed of that too, and the spiral of it went down, and I could feel something at the bottom of it laughing. The fighting did not stop. That is important to understand. We were still at war. The inner districts of Essendra were still held by remnants of the rebel population, and there were still firefights in the narrow streets, still mortar rounds falling on our positions, still the daily mathematics of attack and counterattack, and casualty and replacement. But the fighting changed. It became, and I struggled to find the right word for this, it became intentional. Before, we had fought the way machines fight, executing programmed responses to tactical stimuli. Now, we fought the way artists work. Each engagement was approached not just as a problem to be solved, but as an experience to be inhabited. Soldiers began to take risks that were not tactically justified, but were aesthetically compelling, advancing through fire not because it was the optimal route, but because the movement felt right, because there was a grace in the way a body could flow through a space defined by intersecting lines of deadly light. They fought with a precision that was not mechanical but musical, each action harmonizing with the actions around it, each squad moving in concert like the instruments of an orchestra, and the perfection killed as surely as the enemy did. Grenadier Kethera, the singer, the one whose voice I envied, died because she refused to fire from a position that she called ugly. She moved to a window 3 meters to the left, where the angle of fire would create what she described as a cleaner line, and a rebel sniper put a round through her throat before she could pull the trigger. An artillery spotter called Velin delayed a fire mission for 11 seconds because the coordinates did not form what he felt was an elegant pattern on the targeting grid. In those 11 seconds, a mortar team repositioned and killed 4 soldiers in the forward trench. A squad leader, whose name I never learned, pulled his men back from a secured position because the arrangement of bodies in the room disturbed his sense of symmetry, and the rebels reoccupied the building within the hour. We lost soldiers to the enemy, and we lost soldiers to our own relentless, insatiable need for every action to be flawless. And the deaths that came from perfectionism were, in their way, more Slaaneshi than any demonic intervention could have been. The pursuit of the ideal pushed past the point of reason, past the point of survival, past the point where any sane mind would accept good enough and move on. That is the core of what the Dark Prince offers. Not pleasure, perfection. And perfection, by definition, is a destination you can never reach, which means the journey never ends, and the hunger never stops. The casualties did not decrease. If anything, they increased. But the nature of the casualties changed. Before, men died anonymously, dropping in the mud with their masks on, and their numbers facing up for the quartermaster to read. Now, they died with their faces showing. They died with expressions. They died with names on their lips, sometimes their own, sometimes the names of the soldiers fighting beside them. They died, and the soldiers who witnessed their deaths felt grief. Real grief, the staggering, breath-stealing weight of losing someone who was not just a number, but a person, someone whose face you had seen and whose voice you had heard and whose name you knew. And the grief was terrible, and the grief was glorious, because it proved that the dead had mattered, that their existence had been real and significant and worthy of mourning, and for a soldier of Krieg who has been taught from the moment of decanting that his life has no value except as fuel for the Emperor's war machine, the discovery that his death could cause pain in another human being was the most intoxicating revelation imaginable. More than the sunset, more than the wind, more than the taste of bread or the warmth of water or the secret thrill of having a name, the knowledge that you mattered, that someone would remember you, that your absence would leave a wound in the world. That was the deepest corruption. That was the hook that Slaanesh had buried in our hearts, and by the time we recognized it for what it was, we would not have removed it even if we could, because removing it meant accepting that we did not matter, and we could not go back to that. We had tasted significance, and starvation was no longer an option. The colonel fell on the 52nd day, not in battle, not to a last bolt or a mortar round, but in the quiet of his command bunker, where he removed his mask for the first and only time and sat for 6 hours in silence, breathing the unfiltered air, his face a landscape of emotion that shifted and changed like weather. And when he finally spoke, he said a single word, and the word was a name. His name. The name he had been given in the Vitae womb before his designation was assigned, the name that had been erased from his records and his memory and every official document, the name that should not have existed because the doctrine of Krieg says that names are an indulgence and individuality is a sin. But it was there, buried deep, preserved like a seed in frozen soil, waiting for the warmth to reach it. He said his name and then he wept, and I do not think he wept for grief or for joy, but for the sheer physiological overwhelm of a body that had never been allowed to produce tears, suddenly discovering that it could. His name was Oresk, Colonel Oresk, and from that moment he was no longer 1-1. He was a man, a flawed, feeling, weeping man who had been a weapon his entire life and had just realized at the age of 34 that he had fingers and toes and tear ducts and a heart that could break. I watched all of this with the strange double vision that the corruption granted me. Part of me understood that what was happening was wrong, that the beauty and the feeling and the names were bait on a hook, and the hook was connected to a line, and the line was held by something ancient and patient and infinitely hungry. The other part of me looked at the same evidence and asked, what if the hook is real, and the beauty is real, and the only lie is the one we were told on Krieg? What if the numbness, the anonymity, the cult of death is the real disease, and this awakening is the cure? I know the answer now. Both things were true simultaneously. The awakening was genuine and the corruption was genuine, and they were the same thing. That is how Slaanesh operates. Not by lying, but by telling you a truth so beautiful that you will follow it into the furnace. The beauty is real. The furnace is also real, and by the time you feel the heat, you are already burning, and the burning feels like the most intense experience you have ever had, and you do not want it to stop. The regiment, what remained of it, ceased to be a military unit in any recognizable sense by the 60th day. We still held our positions, still manned the trenches and the gun emplacements, but the rigid hierarchy of rank and function had dissolved into something fluid and organic. Squads formed around affinities rather than assignments. The fighting continued, but it had become almost incidental, a background rhythm against which the real work took place, and the real work was the exploration of sensation, the testing of limits, the discovery of new capacities for experience. The physical changes had accelerated by then, and they could no longer be dismissed as tricks of the light or the natural effects of prolonged sun exposure on skin that had spent its entire existence behind a mask. Our faces were changing. The vitae womb uniformity that had made us interchangeable was dissolving, replaced by something that was individual but also wrong. Wrong in the way that a note played slightly sharp is wrong, recognizably close to correct but vibrating at a frequency that sets your teeth on edge. Features were sharpening, cheekbones pressing outward, jaw lines narrowing, the geometry of the skull beneath the skin rearranging itself toward a symmetry that was too precise, too deliberate to be natural. Eyes were the most disturbing change. The standard brown and gray iris pigmentation of vitae womb stock was bleeding away, replaced by colors that had no business being in a human eye. Violet, a pale, icy pink that seemed to shift hue depending on the angle of light. Pupils that had dilated beyond what any normal response to illumination could explain, wide and black and permanently open, as though they were trying to take in as much of the world as possible and would not be satisfied until they had swallowed all of it. Brennach's eyes had turned the color of a bruise, deep purple shading to indigo at the edges, and when he looked at you, you felt it on your skin like a physical touch, a warmth that started at whatever point his gaze settled on and radiated outward through the muscle and the bone. Our movements changed too. The mechanical efficiency of Krieg drill was replaced by something fluid, something that conserved no energy and wasted no motion, but was not economical in the way that military training demands. We moved the way water moves, the way fire moves, with a grace that served no tactical purpose and existed only because the body had discovered that motion itself could be a form of pleasure. Soldiers walked differently, fought differently, turned their heads and lifted their arms and breathed with a languor that would have been obscene in any barracks on Krieg. The sweet, cloying scent that had been faint in the early weeks was now a permanent presence, emanating from our skin itself, a musk that was part floral and part animal, and part something that had no analog in the natural world. It clung to our uniforms and our equipment and the walls of the buildings where we slept, and it was intoxicating, and it was a warning, and we breathed it in and called it beautiful. Some of these discoveries were benign. Soldiers learned to sing. Soldiers learned to draw. Soldiers learned to cook with the raw ingredients they found in the city's abandoned markets, combining flavors with an instinct that was almost preternatural, as though the resonance engine were teaching them through their taste buds. But here is the thing that the Ordo Hereticus does not understand about the Dark Prince's corruption, the thing that makes it different from the blunt trauma of Khorne or the slow rot of Nurgle. It escalates. The threshold moves. What satisfied you yesterday is insufficient today, and what satisfies you today will be hollow by tomorrow. The bread that had tasted like a revelation in the 5th week tasted like nothing in the 7th. The wind that had made my chest ache with its beauty became ordinary, background, just air, and I found myself climbing to the highest ruined rooftop I could find to feel the full force of the gale on my exposed skin, and even that was not enough. I saw soldiers who had discovered cooking begin to eat their ingredients raw because the act of cooking dulled the intensity of the flavors. I saw a man who had wept at the beauty of a sunset stare at the next one with dead eyes and then turn away in frustration because it did not move him. The capacity for sensation was expanding faster than the available sensations could fill it, and the gap between what we could feel and what we needed to feel was widening every day, and that gap was hunger, and the hunger was bottomless. Other discoveries were darker. The line between pleasure and pain, which for most humans is clearly marked and firmly maintained, became blurred and then erased. Soldiers began to seek out extreme sensations, not because they enjoyed suffering, but because intensity itself had become the goal, and pain was simply another frequency on the spectrum of experience. I saw men hold their hands in open flames and weep with something that was not agony. I saw soldiers carve patterns into their skin with their mono-knives, not the marks of chaos, not the sigils of any dark god, but abstract designs, spirals and curves and flowing lines that followed the contours of muscle and bone, and they did it with an expression of such focused concentration that it looked less like self-mutilation than like art. And through it all, beneath it all, the resonance engine sang. We could hear it clearly now, a vibration that lived in the marrow and the blood and the electrical impulses of the nervous system, and it was beautiful, and it was hungry, and it was getting louder. And in the last weeks, in the days before the 847th arrived, I began to hear something else inside the resonance, a cadence, a rhythm too structured to be random, too purposeful to be a machine's blind output. It had the shape of language, the rise and fall of syllables, the pause between clauses. The engine was not merely broadcasting. Something was speaking through it. Something on the other side of whatever barrier separates the material world from the immaterium was leaning close and whispering, and the whisper was patient, and the whisper was amused, and the whisper had been waiting for a very long time for someone to listen. We did not discuss it. To discuss it would have meant acknowledging that the resonance had intent, that we were being courted by something alive and aware and unspeakably old, and that knowledge would have required us to make a choice, and we had already made ours. The astropathic choir on our troop ship, the Oathbound Vigil, had been sending routine campaign updates since deployment, standard reports, casualty figures, logistics. But the 1143rd's reports had stopped making sense. Units were not where they were supposed to be. Attack schedules deviated without explanation. Requisition orders included musical instruments, pigment powders, bolts of cloth in colors the Departamento Munitorum does not stock. Someone noticed. The system is not efficient, but it is paranoid, and paranoia catches the things that efficiency misses. The response was not inquisitorial. Instead, the notification was routed through a channel I did not know existed, one that connects Krieg's military command directly to its regiments in the field, bypassing the Munitorum entirely. Krieg takes care of its own. I had always understood that to mean our culture of penitence was self-enforcing. I did not understand until the 68th day that the phrase had a darker meaning. Krieg takes care of its own also means Krieg buries its own failures, quietly, thoroughly, because the Death Korps has built its entire identity on the premise that it does not break. And if a regiment breaks, the institutional response is not justice. It is erasure. The 847th Death Korps of Krieg Siege Regiment arrived in the Arsivael system on the 68th day. They came without announcement or coordination. 3 troop ships and an escort squadron, dropping into high orbit with the precise efficiency that is the hallmark of Krieg naval operations. They did not hail us. They did not request a briefing. They simply arrived, began landing operations on the far side of the mountain range, and established a perimeter oriented not toward the city, not toward any enemy on Arsivael Tertius, but toward us. I learned of their arrival from Brennak. He came to me in the ruins of the Skolam, where I had found the library, and he said, "They have sent the cleaners, Varadin." He used my name. He had been using it for weeks, and every time he said it, I felt the same quiet confirmation that I existed as more than a designation. "Who?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. "Krieg," he said, "another regiment. They are not here to help us take the city. They are here to take us." The knowledge settled over the regiment like a change in atmospheric pressure. There was no panic, there was no fear. There was sadness, the deep, quiet kind, the sadness of knowing that something is about to end and there is nothing you can do to prevent it. We had known, all of us, that what we had found could not last, that the Imperium would come for us. We had known it the way a condemned man knows the hour of his execution, always approaching, never quite arriving, until suddenly it is here. Colonel Oresk called the regiment together. Not a command briefing, not an officers' meeting, but a gathering of the whole regiment, or what remained of it. 6,000 soldiers assembled in the open ground behind our trench lines, their faces bare, their weapons at their sides, their eyes turned toward a man who stood on an ammunition crate and looked at them without a mask and without pretense, and without the armor of rank and regulation that had defined his entire existence. He was different. They were all different. The pale, generic faces of the Vitae womb had become individuated by weeks of expression and exposure, marked by sun and wind and the lines that emotion carves into the muscles around the eyes and the mouth. But they had also become something else, something that an outside observer, someone who had not watched the change happen day by day, would have recognized immediately as unnatural. The sharpened features, the too perfect symmetry, the eyes that held colors no human iris should contain, the faint luminescence of skin that seemed to generate its own light in the late afternoon shadow. We did not look like Krieg soldiers any longer. We did not entirely look like Imperial citizens. We looked like something halfway between human and something else, something more refined and more dangerous and more fragile, as though the corruption were sculpting us into vessels for an aesthetic that the warp considered ideal. They were still Krieg. They were still soldiers. But they were also people. And looking at them, 6,000 faces turned toward me, and each one distinct and each one alive was like looking at a miracle and a catastrophe at the same time. The 847th has been deployed to neutralize us, Oresk said, and his voice carried across the assembly without amplification, clear and steady and sad. They will not negotiate. They will not accept our surrender. They have been sent to destroy this regiment and everything it has become, because what we have become frightens them. We took our masks off. We said our names. We looked at each other and we saw people instead of numbers. And for that, Krieg will kill us. Because if even one regiment can break free, then the conditioning is not unbreakable. And if the conditioning is not unbreakable, then every Death Korps soldier in the galaxy is a liability instead of an asset. They are not here because we have failed. They are here because we have shown them something they cannot afford to see. He paused. The wind came down from the mountains, carrying its freight of living scent, and 6,000 faces tilted slightly toward it, and 6,000 pairs of lungs drew in a breath that tasted of green and growing things, and I felt the resonance engine pulse beneath the city, and for a moment, just a moment, the entire regiment was breathing in unison, 6,000 hearts beating to the same rhythm, 6,000 nervous systems vibrating at the same frequency, and we were one thing, one organism, one note in a chord that spanned the gap between matter and the warp, and the note was beautiful, and the note was damned. I will not order you to fight, Oresk said. I have ordered men to their deaths for 34 years, and I have done it without hesitation, because that is what a colonel of Krieg does. But I am not that colonel any longer. I am Oresk, and Oresk does not send people to die, so I am asking you, not ordering. Asking, what do you want to do? The silence that followed was the most profound I have ever experienced. 6,000 soldiers who had never been asked what they wanted, standing in the afternoon light with the wind in their hair, considering a question that should have been the simplest in the world. And yet the answer, when it came, was unanimous. It was not spoken. It simply rose from the assembly like heat from the ground, a shared understanding that passed from face to face without words. We wanted to live. We wanted to keep feeling. We would rather die as people than go back to existing as numbers. The preparations took 2 days. We fortified our positions, not against the rebels who had largely ceased fighting once the resonance engine reached full intensity, and the distinction between attacker and defender had dissolved into irrelevance, but against the 847th. We dug new trenches facing east, toward the mountain passes through which the other regiment would advance. We repositioned the artillery. We established fallback positions and supply caches and all the infrastructure of a defensive siege, because that is what we knew how to do. We were still Krieg, after all. The corruption had changed what we felt, but it had not changed what we were. We were siege soldiers. We were the children of trenches and barbed wire, and the patient, grinding mathematics of attrition. And if we were going to die, we would die in a trench, with a weapon in our hands and a name in our hearts and the wind on our faces. Brennak spent those 2 days in the cathedral doing something that I did not understand until later. He was listening to the resonance engine, not just hearing it as we all did, but actively listening, the way a musician listens to an instrument, learning its frequencies and its harmonics, and the way it responded to the emotional state of the people above it. He emerged on the evening of the second day with an expression that I can only describe as transcendent, and he told us something that changed the shape of everything that followed. The engine could be directed, not controlled, not in any precise sense, but influenced, guided, the way a conductor guides an orchestra, not by commanding each instrument, but by establishing a tempo and a mood and allowing the music to follow. Brennak had been a commissar. His entire training had been about influence, about the manipulation of morale and emotion, about the ability to shape the interior state of the men around him. The resonance engine responded to that skill the way a river responds to a channel cut in its bank. It flowed where he directed it, and Brennak intended to direct it at the 847th. The 847th came through the eastern passes on the morning of the 71st day. I watched them from the forward observation post through a pair of field magnoculars that trembled slightly in my hands, and the sight of them produced a sensation so complex and so contradictory that I am still trying to untangle it. They move the way we used to move, precise, mechanical, economical. 10,000 soldiers in column formation, their masks sealed, their weapons shouldered, their bodies leaning forward into the march with the tireless, relentless gait of men who have no destination except the next order. They were beautiful in the way that a machine is beautiful, in the way that a perfectly constructed weapon is beautiful, and I hated them, and I envied them, and I pitied them, and I feared them, all at once, all tangled together in a knot of feeling that the old me, the mask-wearing, number-bearing, nothing-feeling version of me, would not have been capable of imagining. Their artillery spoke first. Earthshaker rounds, the standard opening gambit of a Krieg siege assault designed to suppress the defenders and create gaps in the defensive perimeter. The shells fell on our forward trenches with the rhythmic precision of a metronome, each impact sending up a fountain of earth and broken stone, each detonation a percussive beat in a composition that I recognized, because it was written in the same manual that I had been trained on, the same manual that every Krieg officer memorizes before their first deployment. Standard pattern bombardment. 7. Sustained, methodical, designed to grind rather than shock, to wear down the enemy's fortifications over hours and days rather than overwhelm them in a single barrage. They were fighting us the way they would fight any enemy. No adaptation. No acknowledgement that the soldiers in the trenches opposite them wore the same uniform, carried the same weapons, had been decanted from the same vitae wombs, and trained in the same cadres, and raised on the same hymns of penitence and self-sacrifice. To the 847th, we were not Krieg. We were not soldiers. We were a contamination to be sterilized, and they approached the task with the same cold proficiency that they would bring to any siege. Our artillery answered. Colonel Oresk directed the counter-battery fire from his command post with a tactical acumen that the corruption had not diminished, because the corruption had never been about making us less competent. If anything, we fought better than we had before. The removal of our emotional inhibitions had not impaired our training. It had enhanced it, freeing us from the mechanical rote of conditioned responses and allowing us to apply our skills with creativity and intuition. Our shells found the 847's gun positions with a precision that would have been impossible under the old regime, when our fire control officers had followed the targeting algorithms in the manual without deviation. Now they could feel the battle, sense its rhythms and its flows, and place their fire where instinct, rather than calculation, told them it would be most effective. The first infantry assault came on the afternoon of the first day. 2 battalions of the 847th, approximately 4,000 soldiers, advanced toward our forward trench line across a kilometer of open ground. Standard Krieg assault doctrine. The same doctrine we had used against Essendra. I watched them come, those masked faces, those identical silhouettes, advancing in lines that were as straight and as uniform as the bars of a prison, and I thought, that was me. 2 months ago, that was me. I was one of those shapes, indistinguishable from the others, moving forward into fire without hesitation. Because hesitation implies choice, and choice implies individuality, and individuality is the one thing that a Krieg soldier is not permitted to have. And now I was on the other side of the firing line, looking down the barrel of my last weapon at men who were my brothers in every way that mattered, and I was going to kill them, and I was going to feel it, and I was going to do it anyway. The first volley from our trenches cut down the front rank of the advance. 200 soldiers fell in the first 3 seconds, their bodies dropping with the boneless limpness of the instantly dead, their masks staring up at the sky through lenses that would never see anything again. The second rank stepped over them without breaking stride. The third rank followed. The fourth. They came on with the implacable patience of a tide, dying in waves, each wave a little closer than the last, each wave a little smaller, and they made no sound except the thud of boots on earth and the hiss of lass fire and the wet, percussive impact of rounds hitting flesh. They did not scream. They did not cry out. They did not call for help or beg for mercy. They died in silence because silence was all they had, because the masks sealed their voices and the conditioning sealed their pain, and they went into the dark the way they had come into the light, without complaint, without protest, without any acknowledgement that the darkness was real and the light had been worth holding on to. I killed 17 of them in the first assault. I know the number because each death burned itself into my memory as an act of witness. Each one mattered to me. Each trigger pull was a decision, a choice, a moment of will that the old me would not have been capable of making because the old me did not make choices. The old me simply fired when ordered and moved on. Now, every shot was a moral event, a small catastrophe of conscience that detonated in my chest and left a crater that would never fill. I killed them, and I grieved for them, and the grief made me hate the architects of this war, not the 847th, who were only doing what they had been made to do, but the system that had made them, the system that had made us, the 500-year legacy of guilt and self-punishment that had turned the children of Krieg into ammunition and called it loyalty. The assault failed. The 847th withdrew, leaving 800 dead on the field, and regrouped behind their artillery line to prepare for the next wave. Standard doctrine. The first assault was never expected to succeed. It was data collection. It established our positions, our fields of fire, our response times. The next assault would be adjusted accordingly, and the one after that, and the one after that. Siege warfare is patient. Siege warfare is relentless. Siege warfare is what Krieg does better than any regiment in the Imperium, and we were now on the receiving end of our own doctrine, and we knew exactly how it worked and exactly how it would end. Brennick went to the cathedral that night. He went alone, without escort, walking through the ruined streets of Essendra with his coat unbuttoned and his cap in his hand, and the candlelight from the cathedral's open doors painting him in gold and shadow. He descended into the crypt beneath the nave, where the pale stone walls gave way to something older, something that was not stone but a smooth, opalescent material that hummed beneath his fingertips. And he followed the old Aldari corridors down and down and down until he reached the engine. I do not know what it looked like. He never described it in terms of shape or size or any visual particular. He described it in terms of sound. He said it was a chord made of millions of voices, each one distinct, each one singing its own note. And the notes combined into a harmony that was so vast and so complex that the human ear could only perceive a fraction of it, the way the human eye can only perceive a fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. He said it was the most sublime thing in the universe, and the most devastating, and that the sublimity and the devastation were the same thing, because both were expressions of intensity, and intensity was the only language that the god behind the engine understood. He directed it. I do not know how. He never explained the mechanism, and I suspect there was no mechanism to explain, no lever or dial or incantation, just the raw exercise of emotional will channeled through a device that was designed to amplify exactly that. He directed the resonance outward, toward the 847th's positions, and he opened the frequency to its maximum, and the engine sang. It reached them the next morning. I know this because the second assault did not come at dawn, as siege doctrine dictated. It did not come at all. Instead, the artillery fell silent, and the passes were quiet, and for 3 hours there was nothing, no movement, no sound, no indication that 10,000 soldiers were arrayed on the other side of the ridge. And then, faintly at first, then with increasing clarity, I heard something that I had never expected to hear from a Krieg regiment. Voices. Not the filtered, mechanical voices of masked soldiers relaying tactical information, but raw voices, unfiltered, unmodified, speaking in tones that ranged from confusion to wonder, to a fear so deep it was almost reverent. They were feeling it. The resonance was working on them the way it had worked on us, and their conditioning, that ironclad, unbreakable, 500 years deep conditioning, was cracking. For a moment, a brief, shining, agonizing moment, I allowed myself to hope. If the 847th felt what we had felt, if they removed their masks and spoke their names and discovered the staggering, unbearable truth that they were alive and that being alive meant something, then perhaps we would not have to die. Perhaps they would understand. Perhaps they would lower their weapons and cross the ground between us and look us in the face with their naked eyes and recognize us as brothers. Not in the anonymous, institutional sense that Krieg uses the word, but in the real sense, the human sense, the sense that means I see you, and I know you, and I will not let you be erased. But I was wrong. The resonance reached the 847th, and they felt it, and for some of them it was the beginning of the same awakening that had transformed us. But the colonel of the 847th was not Colonel Oresk. He was not a man who had ever questioned his conditioning or allowed himself a moment of doubt. He was a product of Krieg in its purest and most concentrated form, a weapon without a safety catch, and when he felt the resonance begin to work on his soldiers, he did not hesitate. He executed every member of the command staff who showed signs of emotional deviation. 14 officers shot in their command bunker with a bolt pistol, their bodies left where they fell as an example. Then he sealed the regiment's rebreathers to maximum filtration, doubled the chemical suppressant dosage in the standard combat stim injections, and ordered the assault to resume at dawn. The resonance could not be filtered. It was not airborne. It was not chemical. It operated on a frequency that passed through masks and armor and bone and went straight to the nervous system. But the colonel's response was not about efficacy. It was about control. By executing the officers and reasserting the chemical regime, he had reminded the 847th what they were. Weapons, tools, numbers. The conditioning was cracking, but it had not broken, and a crack is not a breach, and a wall with a crack in it is still a wall. The 847th put their masks back on. They picked up their weapons. They formed their lines, and they came again. The final assault lasted 4 days. 4 days of continuous fighting, trench to trench, position to position, the 847th grinding forward with the mechanical relentlessness that is Krieg's defining characteristic, and the 1,143rd giving ground slowly, stubbornly, contesting every meter with a ferocity that was fueled not by conditioning but by something far more powerful: desperation. The desperation of men and women who had found something worth living for and were watching it be taken away. We fought like nothing the 847th had ever encountered, not because we were stronger or better armed or more numerous, because we were none of those things, but because we cared. And we fought with sound. I do not know when it started, whether it was deliberate or instinctive, whether Brennack directed it from the cathedral, or whether the resonance engine simply channeled what we were feeling and gave it a voice. But on the second day of the assault, the 1143rd began to sing. Not marching hymns, not the funeral dirges of the Krieg Imperial cult, but something else entirely, something that had no words and no melody in any conventional sense, a harmonic that rose from our trenches in a wave of layered voices, each one finding its own note, each note interlocking with the others to create a chord that was vast and complex and deeply, viscerally wrong. It was not a human sound. It was a sound that human throats produced, but that no human composer had written. A frequency that bypassed the ear and went straight to the brainstem, and it hit the advancing lines of the 847th like a physical force. I saw soldiers stumble. I saw disciplined ranks waver and reform and waver again. I saw a squad leader stop dead in the middle of no man's land and stand motionless for 3 full seconds, his weapon at his side, his masked face tilted slightly upward, and I knew he was hearing it, really hearing it, and that something behind the mask was responding. Then the soldier behind him shot him in the back of the head, and the advance continued, because the 847th had learned by now that hesitation was the first symptom, and the bolt pistol was the only cure. The warp bled through on the 3rd day. Not dramatically, not in the way the training manuals describe, with screaming rifts in reality and demons pouring through in a tide of claws and hunger. It was subtle, almost gentle. Shadows began to move independently of their sources, stretching and contracting with a lazy fluidity that had nothing to do with the angle of the sun. Laughter echoed in empty buildings, soft and musical and coming from no discernible direction. Scent appeared in pockets, intense and localized, a cloud of sweetness in the middle of a ruined street that you walked through, and then it was gone, as though something invisible had just passed close enough to touch. I saw shapes at the edges of my vision, figures that dissolved when I turned to look directly at them, slender and tall and moving with a grace that was both alluring and deeply predatory. They were not fully manifested. The barrier between realms was not broken, only thinned, like a membrane stretched to translucence, and the things on the other side were pressing against it, watching, drawn by the feast of sensation that the engine was broadcasting into the warp. I looked at one of these half-shapes, and for the first time since the corruption began, I felt fear. Cold, lucid, unmistakable fear. And the fear was exquisite. The fear was the most vivid thing I had felt in days, sharp and bright where everything else had begun to dull. And I understood then why the followers of the Dark Prince seek out terror along with ecstasy, why they do not distinguish between the two. Because in the end, it is not the quality of the sensation that matters, it is the intensity. And fear is intense. Fear is very, very intense. But the warp shapes faded when the killing was close, driven back by the sheer density of violence in the trenches and in the gaps between the surreal and the mundane. The war was still a war, and we were still losing it. We cared about the ground we stood on and the people we stood beside, and the names we had given ourselves, and the futures we had dared to imagine. And that caring, that raw investment in our own continued existence, made us fight with a ferocity that turned every trench into a charnel house. On the 3rd night, the 847th breached our secondary line at a junction point between 2 communication trenches, and the fighting became the kind that no manual prepares you for. No fire lanes, no covering positions, just bodies in a ditch, close enough to smell the chemical tang of the other man's rebreather filter, close enough to see the scratches on his mask lenses. A Krieg soldier came over the parapet and dropped into the trench 3 meters from me, his bayonet fixed, his weapon already leveled. I fired and missed, the bolt scorching the sandbag behind his shoulder, and then he was on me. the bayonet driving forward in the short, economical thrust that the training cadres drill into you 10,000 times until the motion is embedded in the muscle. I turned my body and the blade went past my ribs, close enough to slice the fabric of my uniform, and I brought the stock of my lass weapon up into the underside of his mask. The impact cracked the left lens and snapped his head back, and for a fraction of a second I saw his eye through the broken glass, brown and wide and human, and I drove my entrenching tool into the gap between his helmet and his collar. He went down, and the soldier behind him came forward, and I killed that one too, and the one after, and the trench filled with the sounds of close combat, the grunt of exertion and the scrape of metal on metal and the wet finality of blades finding flesh. A woman named Sulveth, who had been a nobody 2 months ago, a number in a platoon roster, fought beside me with a ferocity that was breathtaking, her mono knife in one hand and her las pistol in the other, moving through the press of masked bodies with a grace that was equal parts combat training and corruption, each kill flowing into the next in a continuous motion that looked more like a dance than a fight. She took a bayonet through the thigh and did not stop. She took a lasbolt across her left arm and laughed, actually laughed because the pain was vivid and sharp, and it cut through the mounting numbness that had been creeping over all of us. And for a moment, bleeding in a trench with the enemy pressing in from both sides, she was more alive than she had ever been. She died 20 minutes later when a grenade landed at her feet, and she did not move away because she was in the middle of something that felt like perfection, and she would not break the rhythm. That is what Slaanesh does to soldiers. It does not make them cowards. It makes them artists, and artists will die for the work. Every Krieg soldier is taught that his life is worthless, that his death is the only contribution he can make to the Imperium. We had rejected that teaching, and in its place we had discovered a truth that made us more dangerous than any weapon in the Departamento Munitorum's arsenal. A man who believes his life is worthless will throw it away. A man who believes his life has value will fight to keep it with a savagery that no amount of conditioning can match. But savagery is not enough against mathematics. The 847th had numbers, and they had patience, and they had the cold, grinding inevitability of a doctrine that was designed to win not through brilliance but through attrition. For every position we held, they lost 300 soldiers, and we lost 100, and our 100 could not be replaced, and their 300 could be drawn from the reserves that the 847th's commander held in the passes. By the third day, our strength had been reduced to fewer than 2,000 effective combatants. The artillery was silenced. The trench network had been breached in multiple sectors. The eastern districts of Essendra were in the 847th's hands, and we were being compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter around the city center, around the cathedral, around the engine that had woken us and damned us and given us everything we had ever wanted and everything we were about to lose. Oresk died on the afternoon of the third day. He was leading a counterattack against a breach in our secondary trench line, rallying a platoon of soldiers who were fighting without masks and without helmets and without any of the protective equipment that the manual says a soldier should never be without. And a mortar round landed 3 meters to his left, and the shrapnel took his legs and most of his abdomen, and he died in the mud with his face toward the sky and his eyes open and his lips moving. And the soldiers who reached him said that his last word was a name, not his own name, the name of a soldier he had sent to her death in the first assault on Essendra weeks ago, a soldier he had never known, whose number he had never bothered to learn, and whose face he had never seen. But he had learned it since. He had learned all of their names, all of the dead, thousands of them. And in his final moments, the names poured out of him like blood from a wound, and each one was an act of witness, a refusal to let the dead be forgotten, and the soldiers who heard him wept, and their weeping was a sound that no Krieg regiment had ever made before, and if the 847th's commanders had anything to say about it, would never make again. When the secondary line fell, those of us who remained pulled back toward the cathedral. There was nowhere else to go. The perimeter had collapsed to a few hundred meters of rubble around the central square, and the cathedral's thick stone walls were the only cover left standing. I passed the quartermaster's body on the way. 91, who had first told me the dead were wrong, was lying face up in the rubble with his data slate still clutched to his chest. He had never removed his mask. He had never taken a name. He had felt the resonance and understood what it was, and catalogued it with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. And he had died wearing his number, the last true Krieg soldier in the regiment. I wanted to stop. I wanted to say something, but there was nothing to say that his silence did not say better, so I stepped over him and continued toward the cathedral. I went down into the crypt because I knew the corridors were there, and because, if I am honest, I wanted to be near the engine when the end came. I wanted to hear it singing one last time before the silence. Brennick died in the cathedral. When the 847th Grenadiers breached the doors, he was standing at the altar with his hands raised, not in surrender, but in something closer to prayer, though the god he was praying to was not the Emperor. The resonance engine was at its maximum output, a vibration so intense that the walls of the building were humming and the candles were guttering, and the air itself seemed to throb with a light that had no visible source. He turned to face the Grenadiers and he smiled, and I think the smile is what killed him faster than any doctrine required, because a smile on an unmasked face in a building that was vibrating with the raw energy of the warp was something the 847th had been told to destroy on sight. 3 last bolts to the chest, precise and economical. He did not fall immediately. He stood for a moment, swaying, his bruised dark eyes moving across the faces of the soldiers who had shot him, and I believe he was looking for something behind their masks, some flicker of recognition, some crack in the conditioning that might prove the resonance had reached them after all. Then his legs gave out and he fell backward over the altar and lay there with his arms spread and his mouth still shaped around whatever final word he had been speaking when the light left him. The Grenadiers did not pause to examine the body. They moved on. They cleared the crypt. They found the corridors that led to the engine. And then they reported what they had found, and the report went up the chain of command. And the colonel of the 847th made the decision that had been inevitable from the moment his regiment had entered the system. He could not destroy the engine. The 847th did not have the ordnance or the technical expertise to dismantle a piece of pre-fall Aeldari technology that had been operating for millions of years. And he could not leave it intact, because as long as it was active, it would continue to broadcast its resonance, and any human who came within range would be vulnerable to the same corruption that had taken the 1143rd. The planet itself was the threat. Not the regiment, not the rebels, not the city, but the world, its soil, its air, its water, its stone, everything that the engine's vibration had permeated over millennia of patient, relentless operation. Osivael Tertius was compromised beyond remediation, and for Krieg, which deals in absolutes, there was only one response. The colonel of the 847th sent the order via the troopship's astropathic relay, not to Sector Command, not to the Ordo Hereticus. He sent it to Krieg, to the War Council itself, the shadowy body that oversees every Death Korps regiment in the field. The War Council responded with a single word: acknowledged. The troopship Oathbound Vigil received new orders. The surviving 1143rd crew aboard ship were transferred to the 847th's transports. The Vigil was brought to low orbit, its weapons batteries charged to maximum yield. It was not exterminatus, not in the formal inquisitorial sense. There was no declaration, no ritual, no invocation of the Emperor's authority. There was only a Krieg warship in low orbit and a Krieg colonel on the ground who had ordered his forces to withdraw and who looked up at the sky as the first lance strikes began to fall. I saw the light. I was in the cathedral, in the crypt, in the corridor that led to the engine, and I was alone. And above me the world was ending. The lance strikes punched through the atmosphere like the fingers of an angry god, each one a column of incandescent energy that vaporized everything it touched, stone and steel and flesh and bone, reducing the city of Essendra to a crater of molten slag in the space of minutes. The cathedral collapsed. The corridors buckled. The ceiling came down in slabs of ancient pale stone and older opalescent Eldari material, and I was buried, and the weight of it crushed my legs and my pelvis and something inside my chest that I think was a lung. And the engine screamed, not sang, screamed. The resonance that had been building for weeks, the gentle hum that had become a chord, that had become a voice, it all collapsed into a single frequency of such overwhelming intensity that for a moment I was outside my body, outside my pain, outside every boundary that separates one sensation from another, and I could feel everything at once. The heat of the lance strikes through 100 meters of stone, the cold of my blood leaving my body, the pressure of rubble on my shattered bones, the vibration of the Eldari corridors disintegrating around me, and it was enough. For the first time since the corruption had begun its work, the hunger was full. The threshold that had been climbing every day, demanding more, always more, had finally been met, because nothing is more intense than dying, and dying inside a machine that amplifies sensation 1,000-fold is the closest a human being can come to experiencing infinity. It was magnificent. The engine was still singing. Even as the lance strikes fell, even as the planet's surface was systematically burned away, the engine sang because the engine was deep, deeper than the Krieg bombardment could reach with conventional weapons. Buried in the planet's mantle where the Eldari had placed it millions of years before, and it would take more than a single warship's batteries to silence it. But the people were gone. The 1,143rd was gone. Essendra was gone. The 3 million civilians who had lived and suffered and gone mad above the engine were gone. And without minds to resonate with, without nervous systems to amplify and emotions to feed on, the engine song faded to a whisper, and the whisper faded to a hum, and the hum settled back into the bedrock to wait for the next time someone built a city above it. I am still here, in the dark, under the rubble, with the engine humming softly in the stone around me, and my body broken, and my name still mine, Viradin. I can see my hands in the faint luminescence that my own skin provides, that pale, wrong light that the corruption gifted us, along with everything else, and my fingers are long and tapered, and they do not look like a soldier's hands anymore, and I do not care. I am saying my name aloud because there is no one left to hear it, and saying it aloud is the only proof I have that it was real, that any of it was real. That for 75 days on a world called Lower-hive Tertius, 10,000 soldiers of Krieg removed their masks and looked at the sun and learned each other's names and discovered that they were alive, and that being alive was the most beautiful and the most terrible thing that had ever happened to them. The records will not show this. The Departamento Munitorum will record that the 1,143rd was lost with all hands during a routine pacification operation on Lower-hive Tertius. The planet will be reclassified as a dead world. The designation 1143rd will be recycled and assigned to a new regiment, freshly decanted, freshly masked, and they will never know that the number they carry was once worn by soldiers who had names. The 847th will return to active service. Their casualties will be attributed to enemy action. Every astropathic record, every logistical filing, every piece of documentation that could connect the 1143rd to the word corruption or the word Slaanesh will be found and destroyed. Krieg takes care of its own. Krieg buries its own failures. And this failure will be buried deeper than all the others, because it is not a story of weakness. It is a story of strength, the wrong kind of strength, the kind that the Death Korps and the 500-year architecture of guilt and self-punishment cannot survive. The engine hums. My blood is pooling beneath me, warm and wet and real. The pain is fading now, which means the end is close, and I am not afraid. That is the last gift, the last corruption, the last beautiful, terrible thing that Ossaviel Tertius gave me. I am not afraid to die, not because I do not value my life the way a Krieg soldier does not value his life, but because I have lived it, briefly, imperfectly, in a way that the Imperium would call heresy, and that the dark things in the warp would call worship, and that I, in the privacy of my own fading mind, call human. I have felt the wind. I have tasted bread. I have read a name in a book and made it my own. I have seen the faces of my brothers and sisters, and I have wept for them, and they have wept for me. I have looked at a sunset and known, in every fiber of my being, that it was beautiful, and that beauty matters, and that the capacity to recognize beauty is not a weakness, but the very thing that makes a life worth defending. My name is Varadin. I was a soldier of Krieg. I was 612. I was both of those things, and the space between them is the space where I lived. It was not a long life, but it was mine. The engine hums, the dark is warm. Somewhere far above me, the sky is burning, and I am not afraid.